because my name is Chip Aaron with Pierce Atwood. I do represent Poland Spring on permitting issues. Because there didn't seem to be much in the way of comments on the law, I wanted to at least put out a few of those. With regard to GATT and trading goods, trading goods is what's regulated by GATT. Regulation of water in its natural state before it is put in a bottle is not regulated by GATT. With regard to GATT and GATTs, it's also critical to understand that any challenge before the WTO is brought by a member nation against another nation. It's not brought against the town. It's not brought against the state. It's brought by one country against another country. The WTO cannot order a rewrite of federal, state, or local law. Can't do it. With regard to GATTs and trade and services, also it doesn't apply to water-related services. The concern that Mr. Warren has raised is it might sometime in the future. Certainly I encourage you to keep an eye on that and make sure that it doesn't. We don't have a problem with that. But the issue has little to do with Nestle's work as a bottler. Again, GATS is a WTO agreement, and the limits are, as I just mentioned, with regard to GATT. Final issue is international investment agreements. Those are different from the WTO agreement. The WTO framework, where nations sue other nations over trade laws, rights are created in specific trade agreements. Methanex was a challenge to California's MTBE regulations, which were designed to protect groundwater. The United States won that case, and California's ability to regulate was upheld. Glamis Gold was a challenge to the U.S. Department of Interior and California environmental regulations. Again, the U.S. won this case. The challenge regulations were upheld. Metalclad has been cited in lots of different ways, and I simply urge you to read the case, because the manner in which it's been cited is not accurate in many instances. The United States has never lost an IIA challenge under NAFTA. Buy American procurement provisions, mad cow disease quarantines, and environmental regulations have all been upheld. It may be worth noting that IIAs cannot actually be used to directly rewrite or invalidate any federal, state, or local law or regulation. The remedy in these disputes is money damages, which are paid by the federal regulation. The state laws are not going to be overturned or changed by any of these. The last comment is that this comes from Mr. Warren's organization, that a non-discriminatory regulation for public purpose, which is enacted with due process, cannot constitute an expropriation. And I think Deputy Attorney General Pissner has already mentioned that to you previously. So those are a few comments on the law. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Rick Knowlton. I'm Vice President of Operations for Aqua Maine. We're the largest investor-owned water utility in Maine. We serve 20 different municipalities across the state, some for more than 50 years. We're part of a larger corporation by the name of Aqua America. It's traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The ticker symbol is WTR. We're a domestically owned company, but here in Maine, we provide water utility services, and those are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. I read the preliminary report on water policy and international trade law by William Warren, and quite honestly, I was a little disappointed. I was disappointed that he left seemingly open several questions that have been debated and in Maine law made clear, in my opinion. For example, in the very first paragraph, he suggests that Maine may want to consider measures to regulate the export of water to internal and international markets. But we do that. We have a bulk water transport law. We've had a bulk water transport law for many years. Mr. Warren apparently didn't get a chance to read that law before he wrote his report. I won't get into full details of my concerns, but I would refer you to a different article. An article by a lawyer from Los Angeles, Mr. Scott Slater. He is also the adjunct professor and lecturer on water law and policy at Pepperdine University. He wrote a paper entitled State Water Resource Administration in the Free Trade Agreement Era, as Strong as Ever. In short, Mr. Slater describes in detail that NAFTA, GATT, and GATS do not threaten Maine's or any other state's water resource management authority. and that's the key. In Maine, water rights are an interest in real property to which trade laws do not apply. Maine remains free to apply even-handed water management laws as it deems appropriate, and I think the AG's office would support that. Mr. Warren also raises concerns as to whether the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, might someday apply to water and wastewater services here in Maine. As a private corporation providing water utility services to 20 different municipalities for decades, I can assure you that the Maine Public Utilities Commission and Title 35A provide appropriate limits and controls that restrict return on investment. For many years, our corporation was owned in part by a foreign investor. There was a wave in the late 80s, early 90s of foreign investment in water and wastewater utilities across the country. One earlier speaker mentioned one such company. Many of those companies are long gone. Their investments have been traded on to other people. In closing, I'd ask that you continue to focus on reasonable regulation of Maine's water resources before it can be considered a good, a product, or a service.
Good evening. I'm Chris Jackson from the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. We represent about 5,000 businesses statewide here in Maine. And I really wasn't sure what I was going to say here today, but I'm certainly not an expert on international trade agreements. But I do know that only the Maine legislature can write or rewrite Maine laws. And we heard something earlier about international entities dismantling our laws through these trade agreements. I'm certainly not aware of any such case ever happening here in Maine. And many of you know that water extraction here in the state is a very heavily regulated enterprise by the DEP, DHHS, and the Maine Geological Survey. It requires permits and constant monitoring that can be adjusted if the need arises. And we've heard a lot about international companies, and as someone who spent most of the summer and fall traveling around and visiting with employers here in Maine, I mean, I can tell you that I think we need a little more foreign investment in this state. And that may not be a popular thing to say, but businesses are struggling out there. And I'd say for every one business that is growing, 4 or 5 others are facing serious layoffs and cutbacks. And there are hard times out there. Last week, Laura LaChance was on the cover of the Kennebec Journal here, and she said that, you know, over the last 12 months, unemployment in this state has risen about 50%. It's up to about 8.5% here. Bankruptcies have risen about 33% in the last 12 months, and foreclosures similarly are on the rise. So while we talk about international companies, I mean, I think this is probably really about Poland Springs, so we might as well just get that out there. And here's a company that 30 years ago was bankrupt. Today they employ about 800 people with a payroll of somewhere between $40 and $50 million. And that's in addition to the $50 or $60 million that they pay associated vendors and contractors. And they get this from utilizing a natural resource that we have an abundance of here in Maine, and that replenishes itself naturally. And I think, you know, the Chamber believes this is the type of business, the type of industry that should be encouraged, not discouraged. And we think the present groundwater laws and regs are rigorous and appropriate to ensure that the groundwater is protected and that its use is sustainable and reasonable. Thank you.